know there will be others joining us over the next few minutes. There are people coming down the stairway, but I want to get started early because we're going to end right at 8 o'clock to give you enough time to get back for the first presidential debate this evening. Before we begin, however, I've invited a guest here, Caitlin, who's a senior in political communications, and she has an announcement to make about voter registration, and she asked if she could, and I said, well, this is the perfect audience. Caitlin, you want to join us for a few minutes and tell us what you're up to and what your group is doing?
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Rhodes. I'm a senior here at Northeastern. I'm also one of the 2012 fellowship class of Young People 4, YP4 for short. YP4 is a leadership development program that identifies, engages, and empowers young progressive leaders to create lasting change in their communities. This year we are conducting a national, nonpartisan Get Out the Vote campaign to increase the participation and representation of young people in the electoral process. I am one of 54 organizers on 36 campuses in 19 states plus DC. Our goal is to register 26,000 new voters and mobilize 68,000 young voters at the polls. As students, we care about a lot of issues, and we are profoundly affected by public policy. Yet we are disproportionately silent when it comes to voting and the decisions that affect us. America's future is our future. And on Election Day, it is our civic duty to raise our voices through our votes. Voting has been painted as some private, isolated activity. Yet it is the largest joint action that we take as Americans. On Election Day, we have the opportunity to come together in the same moment and speak up with equal weight, regardless of gender, class, age, ethnicity, etc. But this year is different, because recent legislation is keeping 21 million Americans from casting their votes. These are primarily students, communities of color, low income, elderly, disabled, soldiers, and veterans. That's why I'm working to register and mobilize young voters in this election, and all of you can help. If you are a student, register at your current address. I have registration forms. I will be at the table outside during the break. Come find me. If you're part of a group, I'd love to come talk to your members about registering and getting out the vote. If you are faculty, consider letting me talk to your classes and register your students. If you represent an organization and have events coming up, let's collaborate. Got money? You can talk to me. Got people? Please come talk to me. For the rest of you, I need volunteers. Come find me at the break so we can exchange contact information. Thank you.
You know, it's wonderful to work at a university where we have so many students who are doing so many good things like that. So I want to really thank Caitlin again for the work she's doing and the students she's working with. I also want to make an announcement that I am so proud of, and it has to do with the new website, Cognoscenti, which is the WBUR new website, a new section of the website, and we have just basically signed an agreement with WBUR so that every Wednesday we will be featured on a special site called Advice to the Next President. It's already up. It went live this morning. Luke Hill, who's over here, registered, and John Sargent. It's a beautiful site. If you go in, you'll see already they've posted Larry Summers and Greg Mankiw, and they've posted Tom Koken and John Quokka, and next week they'll post our guest speaker and me, and we'll keep doing that every week. So keep tuned. Check WBUR.org. Go to Cognoscenti. It's a wonderful day when you can cooperate with one of the best radio stations in the land, and you can not only hear car talk, but you can learn about us. Well, today we're going to switch attention from fiscal and monetary policy, labor policy, and income and industry policy, to take a look at what has happened in America in terms of income inequality. We'll take a quick look at wealth from some brand new numbers on wealth. And then we're going to, with our guest speaker, who I'll introduce at the end of my talk, talk about income mobility and the movement within generations and across generations, which is the other part of inequality. The reason we're going to do that, as I'll quickly say at the end of my talk, but I hope we'll get into some good questions after the break, is if these numbers are disturbing to you, are there government policies that we should be thinking about to deal with them? And we'll talk a little bit about that this evening. So, let me move to our presentation. Maybe John can help me here, bring up what I put together for you tonight. Thank you, John. So what I did to prepare for this class is I pulled together a lot of data. Most of it is official US data, but it's been compiled by an organization in Washington called the Economic Policy Institute, which just celebrated its 25th anniversary. Truth in Advertising, I was one of the 5 people who started the Economic Policy Institute back 26 years ago, along with Ray Marshall, former Secretary of Labor in the Carter administration, Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, Lester Thoreau, an esteemed professor at MIT Sloan School, as well as a small number of other people. And it was set up 26 years ago in order to bring data together to better understand the state of America's labor force, the labor market, and to really shed light on what was happening in the economy. And soon after it began, the Economic Policy Institute started publishing every other year the State of Working America, a compilation, book-length compilation of loads of data on what is happening in the American labor market. And this has been used over and over again. You can actually download your own copy without actually having to buy it. I'm not supposed to say that. If you just go to EPI.org, economicpolicyinstitute.org, check out Working America, the State of Working America, and all of the charts and all of the discussion can be found there. It is useful reading. So what I'm going to do is go through a lot of numbers, because what I want to do is set the stage for a discussion about what do we do when you see what's happening in America. So the first I'm going to look at is real median family income going back to the end of World War II right through 2010. And you'll see that generally income was rising for families up to around 2000. There are dips in there that you'll see that correspond to periods of time when we've had a recession. But generally we saw fairly rapid increases in real median family income. Real means this is all inflation adjusted. In this case, it's in 2010 dollars. Now, what's fascinating about this is if you were to look at that data from 1947 to 1973, you'd actually find out that during that period of time, 1947 to 1973, median family income literally doubled. It went up by 104%. What that means is that the typical family in America had twice as much consumption power in 1973 as it did in 1947. Or maybe to put it in more common terms, a family that could afford to go out to dinner once a week in 1947 could afford to go out to dinner twice a week in 1973. A richer family that could afford to buy their first home in 1947, by 1973 was considering the possibility of a summer home as well, perhaps out on the Cape. But if you look between 2000 and 2010, this last decade, we've actually seen a decline in median family income. And indeed, just last week, the Census Bureau announced that median family income for 2011 was lower than in 1995. Lower today than 16 years ago. So we've seen this happening, and indeed, a lot of what I think will be discussed tonight, particularly by Mr. Romney, is going to be referring to statistics like this. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, or 8 years ago, or for that matter, 12 years ago, or perhaps even 16 years ago? That data shows you what we see here. And just since 2007, in 3 years, median family income has fallen by 6.4%. So this is what we have. The other thing that's interesting is to see something that Professor Kochen had in his talk, which is the divergence between productivity growth and real inflation-adjusted median family income. And what you'll find here is that productivity and real median family income rose in tandem between 1947 and about 1975, and then began to diverge and have been diverging further and further apart. Historically, labor economists have thought that as productivity goes up, our real standard of living should go up. In fact, that's the main thing that drives an increase in standard of living. And while it may have improved the standard of living for some people, in terms of those people in the middle, the median, of course, is half the people are below the median, half are above, we've seen that growing divergence so that while we've had significant productivity increase, in fact accelerating at the end, after the end of the, in the middle of the 1990s on, family incomes have stagnated while productivity has gone up. There's something wrong when you have this growing differential between productivity growth and family incomes, right? If we just look at working families, those who have at least one worker in them, the decline has been even sharper than for all families. In fact, part of the reason is that retired people have not seen their income fall because of Social Security and because of 401ks and pensions. But it's working people who've really suffered, falling by 7.6% since 2000 over the decade. If we look at it in terms of what has happened in terms of the distribution of family income, and here I'm looking at average family income, and we've divided this into 5/5, or we call them quintiles. You'll see the bottom fifth, the second middle fifth, those are kind of the median, the fourth fifth, and then the top. And then we have the top, the people who are in the top 5%, and then finally, I'm sorry, between the 80th and the 95th percentile, and then the top 5%. Well, if you look here in what I've circled up here, you've seen what has happened to the bottom in terms of their real, in this case we're using 2011 dollars, to their income since 1989, going back even further than 1995. So they had an income of $16,575, the bottom 20% average. In 1989, it's now only $15,464, right? 22 years later, a generation later. An entire generation goes by and people in the bottom 20% are doing worse than a generation ago. If we look at the middle families, we'll see that they've actually seen some increase in their income since 1989, right? But they've certainly seen that decline since 2000. And if we look at the very top 5%, I'm not looking at the top 1%, but the top 5%, we've seen their income rise from, in real dollars, from about $260,000 a year average family income to about $323,000. They also have suffered over the decade, but certainly saw a very sharp rise between 1989 and 2010, when we saw a rise of only about $2,500 for people in the middle, a decline for those people at the bottom, and an increase over that period of time of about $60,000 to $70,000 for the top 5%. and well more than that for the top 1%. Okay? One of the questions you might ask is, where do people get their money by quintile? So again, I hope you can see this. The bottom, second, middle, fourth, top, the 90th to the 95th percentile, the 95th to the 99th, and then the top 1%. So if you were to look at the share of total pre-tax income, this is before we take your taxes out, for those people in the bottom 20%, they get about half, on average, get about half their income from wages. They get another 20% from transfers. That could be Social Security, unemployment benefits, workers' benefits, maybe TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. And they get about another 15% of their income in kind. That would be food stamps, that might be Medicaid, things like that. The middle America gets about 61% of their income from wages. They get about 9 to 10% of their income from transfers, including Social Security. And they get about 11% of their income from in-kind, again, from things like Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. Medicare, not Medicaid. If you look at the top fifth, they get less than half their income from wages, just like poor people. Except they get 13.8% of their income from capital gains, and very little from cash transfers or in-kind. And then if you look at the top 1%, only about a quarter of their income comes from wages, almost a third comes from capital gains, and almost nothing, about 1%, comes from transfers of one kind or another, including Social Security. And then if we were to look at, I don't have it here, Mitt Romney, if we had his tax forms, it would show even a much larger amount coming in the form of capital gains, non-wage earnings. So you can just see the increase in capital gains as a form of income from 0.3% on the bottom 20%. You might think of somebody who's elderly, living not very well, but still has a few stocks and bonds, or stocks. The middle, 0.6%. The top fifth, only 14%, but as I said, almost a third of income comes from capital gains. Now, we're not going to be talking about taxes today, but as many of you know, capital gains prefer tax status, and so a dollar earned in capital gains is taxed at a much lower rate than a dollar earned, for instance, working on a blast furnace, right? And just the opposite, of course, in terms of in-kind. I guess now we're talking about the 47% who are living off of cash transfers and in-kind, or even the middle, who are getting about 20% of their income that way. Well, we're also interested, of course, in what's happening in terms of relative well-being of different groups and how that has changed over time. This is the beginnings of thinking about the income distribution. Well, you'll see that between 1973 and 2011, real earnings in 2011 dollars for full-time men has actually declined by 4.8%. I didn't even know that number. For women, it's grown by about 30%. And if you want to think about the gender gap for a minute, that we will certainly see in the polls coming out over the next few weeks, it's not surprising to see this. That in fact, over the last 40 years or so, women have improved their status, improved is the best word to use, in terms of their income, while full-time men have actually seen their income go down. And I think that's part of my reason I may have mentioned earlier in an earlier class that if we wanted to support what is generally the liberal agenda, the easiest way to do that would be to pass a constitutional amendment taking away the vote from white men. These data seem to support that position. If you look at the female-male ratio back in 1973, it was 57%, right? It's basically 3/5, which actually has biblical references, if I remember, from Leviticus, that women were worth 3/5 of what men were in the Old Testament several thousand years ago. And that's where we were roughly in 1973 as well in the United States. By 2011, that's gone from 57% to 77%. So we've seen a significant improvement in women's earnings. Again, these are median annual real earnings. But still, women on average are making only 77% of what men are doing, but obviously doing much, much better than they were doing some time ago. So women have improved, men have seen their actual incomes fall, and but the ratio, of course, has increased. If we want to look at it by race and ethnicity, you'll see what has happened in terms of here, white, black, Hispanic, what their median family income was. And then on the right-hand side, the two columns on the right-hand side are the ratio of black family income to white family income and Hispanic family income to white family income. And you'll see that since 1969, or 1979 for Hispanics, we don't have data earlier, incomes rose for whites, they rose for blacks. Incomes for Hispanics have been basically stable and then falling. Rising and then falling. So if we look at the data in terms of the ratio, certainly back in 1947, in days of massive discrimination in Jim Crow, the typical black family in America earned had an income half of the typical white family. By 1995, they were up to about 61%, and that's where they've been pretty much ever since. In fact, it went up a little bit and has come down since then in the last year or so. Hispanics actually had a higher ratio of Hispanic median family income to white in 1979. And then it falls rather precipitously from 69% to 58%. And in fact is now still at about 63%. They might think, what went wrong with Hispanics? Well, the answer is nothing actually went wrong with Hispanics. What happened was massive immigration of Hispanics over that period of time. And many of the Hispanics who came, particularly from Central America, North Mexico and Central America, were coming with fewer skills, some discrimination against them. And the result is that on average, their median family income came down because of this change in the composition of the Hispanic population. So we see what happened there. If you see it over time, you'll see the real median household income for white, non-Hispanic whites in the top, again quite flat from 1999 on. Similarly, you'll see it for Hispanics and blacks below them. So you have a pecking order of non-Hispanic whites. They didn't have Asian numbers. They would be very close to the white number, the white non-Hispanic numbers, then drop down to Hispanic numbers, and then down to black. This is the kind of inequality we have by race and ethnicity. If you see the ratio of black and Hispanic household income to white household income, you'll see blacks rising and then flattening out. You see the Hispanics coming down, again because of the immigration, and now Hispanics are still somewhat higher than blacks, but also kind of flattening out. Another way to think about it is what has been the impact of this Great Recession on incomes by quintile. So if you look to the right part of this, the right part of this chart, you'll see what has happened since the Great Recession began officially in December of 2007. You'll notice that for the top 5% of all families, their income has basically stayed the same. For the top 20%, or the 80th to the 95th percentile, their incomes fell by about 4. If you look at the median family in the middle fifth, their income fell by about 8%, and the bottom fifth suffered a 10% drop in their median income over that Great Recession. The poorer you are to begin, the more your income was hurt. Since the beginnings of a recovery in 2010, the declines in family incomes have fallen, but only one group has really done quite well in the recovery, and that's the top 5%, who have seen their incomes recover by about 5%, largely because of recovery in their wealth positions, whereas everyone else still, even since 2010, saw their incomes decline. Another way to think about this is over the longer period, and this is the one I was talking about. If you look at 1947 to 1979, which are the blue bars, you'll see what was true about the annual growth in family income by each of the quintiles. And remember, I told you that between 1947 and 1973 at least, median family income doubled. So income was growing very, very rapidly. The question was, how was it shared? How was it shared? And the answer was, it was shared equitably. In fact, of all the quintiles, it was the lowest quintile that saw their income rise the fastest. I would argue in part because of the anti-poverty programs that were instituted in the 1960s in the middle of this period. So if you look at the lowest fifth, they saw their annual income go up on average 2.6% a year between 1947 and 1979. That was actually somewhat higher than what was true of the highest fifth, who saw their income rise, but by 2.2%. So that period, 1947 to 1979, I once wrote a book in which I call those the glory years in America, were years in which we had rapid economic growth, more equitably shared. From 79 through 2010, we saw virtually little growth, and certainly no growth at all, in median family income after 1995. But notice how whatever growth we got was distributed. We actually saw a decline in this period of time going all the way back to 1979, a generation ago, of minus 0.4% per year over that whole long period, 79 to 20. A growth of only 0.1% per year for the second fifth. And if you look at kind of the middle family in America, since 1979, they saw their income grow at only 0.3% per year, right? As opposed to 2.4%. So basically, they're growing at 1/8 as fast as their income rose annually between 47 and 79. It's the highest fifth that did best. They didn't do as well as the generation before them. But that is what has been happening in America. So we saw a flattening out in income to the point of almost no income growth, and what income growth we had, more unequally distributed. And here's another way to look at it in terms of the growth in income from 1973 to 2010. You'll see at the 0% line, where this all starts, over time, you'll see the 20th percentile ends up right where it began. The median ended up a little bit higher, about 10% cumulative, and the 95th percentile saw their income cumulative grow by 50%. That's inequality. That's inequality with a vengeance. Okay? So let me quickly say something about poverty. Here are the poverty statistics, including the latest for 2011, last year. In 1959, before we had a war on poverty, we had more than 1 out of 5 people in America were officially poor. Let me tell you how poverty is measured. In 1964, months after John F. Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon Johnson was president, Johnson gives a speech and he declares a war on poverty, quote unquote, a war on poverty. And he gets back to the White House, and one of his staff comes in and he said, "Mr. President, congratulations on declaring war on poverty, but I have one question. How will you know if we've won?" We had no poverty statistics. We had nothing to define poverty, and therefore we had no way of measuring whether we were winning the war. And so a call was made over to then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the predecessor to HUD. And the question was, how will we know if we're winning the war against poverty? And they turned to a young staffer named Molly Orshansky, a statistician, and said, "Molly, single American citizen, could you come up with a poverty threshold that we could use to measure poverty in America?" And she said she would do it. And she had about 2 weeks to do it. And she went over to the Department of Agriculture and said, "Let me start with a food budget to build this poverty threshold." And she says, "Do you have a food budget here that we might use that would be nutritionally sufficient, but rather inexpensive?" And they said, "Yes, we've actually developed a food budget for a post-nuclear America, a post-nuclear war America. And it has so many calories, and it has so many vitamins, and it has so much protein." And they costed that out in 1964, and it was roughly $1,000 to feed a family of 4 for a year. And then they found out that, in general, to pay for everything else, rent, clothing, heat, electricity, would take about 3 times as much as the food budget. And that's how we got the first poverty budget, about $3,200 for a family of 4. Every year since then, the poverty threshold has gone up a little bit, equal to the cost of living. The cost of living for an urban family of 4. And they've adjusted it for smaller families and large families. But today it's about $23,000 for a family of 4. Think about living on $23,000 in Boston. And when they used that and calculated based on data they had from 1959, they found out that 22.4% of the people lived in families that were below that poverty threshold, given the size of their families. We then had a war on poverty, in which we developed all kinds of programs, from job training programs to trade readjustment assistance for people who lost their jobs because of exports or offshoring. We had housing programs, and indeed, we dropped the poverty rate in half, from about 22% to about 11%. Apparently, we declared the war over, and ever since that time, poverty rates have either stabilized or, over the last 5 years, or since 2001, have risen from about 12% to about 15%. And so our poverty rate in America today, in 2011, is actually as high as it was in 1965. Another way to look at it is what has happened to the percentage of people who aren't absolutely poor, but are close to the poverty line, let's say at living on a family of 4 on a budget of about $46,000 or less. That's 1/3 of the American people. We can look at poverty rates by race and ethnicity. These are for 2011, and we can see it by age. For those who are 18 to 64, in other words, most of us, but not me in this room, among whites, less than 10% are officially poor under that poverty line of $23,000 for a family of 4, adjusted for family size. But 24% among blacks, 1 out of 4, and about 1 out of 5 Hispanics fall under poverty, ages 18 to 64. If you look at children or young adults under age 18, rises a little bit. 12.5% of kids or people under age 18, among white kids, 1 in 8, but nearly 40% of blacks under the age of 18, and more than 1/3 of Hispanics. And if you look at children under age 6 in families, where they're under age 6, it's almost 15% of children in white families. It's over 43%. 2 out of every 5 black children under the age of 6 is living in a poor family. That's $23,000 or less a year if it's a 4-person family. And 36% of Hispanics. Okay? Where we've seen the greatest decline in poverty has been among the elderly. That's fallen from about a 35% poverty rate back in 1959 to 8.7% in 2011. On the other hand, you'll see the poverty rates rising among children. And the reason why the poverty rate has come down so rapidly for the elderly is Social Security. It's part of the reason also why that's really a third rail. You touch Social Security, and this diagram could change very rapidly. Some of you may remember, and I think I mentioned it, I wrote in my Boston.com blog a piece a few months ago called "The Senior Discount, a Gift for the Rich." And I pointed out that when the first discounts for, let's say, the T, the MBTA, or discounts at the local theater, or discounts at Wendy's, or discounts at the national park, I have a $10 national park card that will let me into any national park for the rest of my life. But this made some sense in 1959 when the poverty rates were so high. Today, among the elderly, the poverty rates are among the lowest, and yet we provide people like myself who ride the Orange Line in a 3-piece suit with a 60-cent fare, but the young woman with 2 kids is paying full fare. There's something wrong with it. So I said, we should get rid of these. I'm still dealing with the death threats I've gotten from people who are circling my house with walkers, torches, and pitchforks. We can see the difference by family type. Female-headed families, 41% are still poor in America, down from about 60% in 1959. And then you'll see married couples with children, some of you in the room, a 9% rate. We can see it by age. Again, it's overwhelmingly on young people. Finally, I want to talk about just two things. One, the wealth distribution. I'm not going to bore you with lots of data, but these are new data, not published yet. They'll be coming out later this year from a study by Ed Wolf at NYU in a publication from the Russell Sage Foundation. I'm the editor of this paper, so I have these data. Please do not distribute. But this is what we know in terms of median net worth from 1983 to 2010 for whites and blacks. So in 1983, the median wealth for white families, that is, take half the population and calculate that person at the middle, had just under $100,000 worth of assets in net worth in 2010 dollars. Typical black family had $6,400. They had 7% of the wealth of whites. By 1998, whites were up to $109,000 in net worth in today's dollars. But blacks had improved to about by 1992, had improved to about $16,000, and they'd risen to 17%. It then declines in 1998. It declines more in 2007, which was the peak wealth, about $150,000 for whites, down to $9,700 for blacks. And just 3 years later, the net worth of black families has fallen by half in 3 years. Most of that is the loss in housing value. Whites have also seen their income come down, but not their wealth come down, but not as much. And finally, before I introduce our special guest, I want to talk about what I said I would talk about. Murder on the Inequality Express. And I mentioned last week, for those of you who were here, this is one of my favorite books of all time, Murder on the Orient Express, the great Hercule Poirot, a murder mystery by Agatha Christie. And in 1992, I wrote a piece on inequality, 1992, that appeared in a journal called American Prospect. I called the article Murder on the Inequality Express. The editors unfortunately took off the first two words. I like it better this way. If you remember or have read, and I asked you to read it as the reading for this week, Agatha Christie, a fellow is found dead on the Orient Express. And Hercule Poirot happens to be on that train, and he's called in by the authorities to try and solve the crime. And he starts to interview everybody who was on the train in the certain cabins, the first-class cabins. And he interviews them to find out what their alibi was and whether they could have been responsible for the murder of this guy, because the train had not stopped. There was nobody else who could have gotten on. And the guy was surely alive when he got on. And in the end, Hercule Poirot comes to the conclusion, unlike every other Agatha Christie murder, that in fact it wasn't a single assassin, it was a dozen of them or so, 10 of them, I think. And he figures it out because this guy was killed by a knife. Clearly some of the thrusts were by a right-handed person, some of them were by a left-handed person, some of them were by somebody very strong that cut deeply into his body, and others were very light. And I thought about that, and the whole question of inequality. And I realized that this was a good metaphor for what was happening in America. Because some years ago, economists, once they recognized that inequality was in fact a problem, started asking the question, why is it? And most economists, not all, came to the conclusion that the reason was fundamentally technology. That we had had a technological revolution, and we had something that economists call skill-biased technological change, which simply says that as our economy has expanded and we've used more and more innovative technology, there's a small group of people who are skilled to take advantage of that technology, and then they get paid very good salaries because there's a small supply of them and a big demand. And we have fewer and fewer jobs that require regular skills or no skills. And we have a large supply of those folks, but not much demand, and therefore their wages go down. Simple supply and demand. And that really explains it, and therefore if you want to solve it, possibly the only way you can solve it is by reskilling the people who have too few skills to succeed. But there were many economists who said, it's too bad this is happening, but it's kind of inevitable. There's not much you can do about it. And the best you can do is maybe make the schools a little bit better for people who are not getting very good schooling. I thought about that for a while, and I said, I'm sure that's part of the answer. But to think that that's the only thing going on that could explain such a mammoth increase in inequality just didn't seem right to me. So I started thinking about other suspects. My second suspect, having come, as most of you know, from Detroit, Michigan, was deindustrialization. The loss of literally millions and millions of manufacturing jobs, many of them high-paying manufacturing jobs for people of moderate skill, on the assembly lines of America, in the steel mills, in the auto companies, in all the industries that manufacture. And as we lost those jobs, we lost middle-class jobs, and the jobs taking their place were at McDonald's. We also had deregulation of key industries, where regulated industries often paid higher wages because they could pass it along in terms of higher prices. The telephone company, for example, or interstate trucking, or buses. And we also had declining unionization. Very important for working class folks. We had about 36% of America's workforce in unions in 1955. Today it's less than 13% and only 7% in the private sector. We had the downsizing of businesses. In general, large businesses pay higher wages than small businesses. General Motors paid larger than their parts suppliers. But as we saw the downsizing, this also had an effect. And we had winner-take-all labor markets, where a small number of people, for example, who play for the Yankees and used to play for the Red Sox, get enormously high salaries because of the very special skills they have. And more of the total wage bill going to a smaller and smaller group of people. Free trade, which meant that lots of products could come into the country at much lower prices than we could build them here with our labor costs, which either meant that people got laid off or they took large wage cuts, as auto workers have had to take. And capital mobility, the ability to move capital from the United States to other places to take advantage of low-wage labor, again, driving a wedge between wages and driving a wedge between incomes. Immigration itself might have played a role too, as some people came in and employers would take advantage of them, sometimes illegally, paying them less than the minimum wage. And finally, the whole question of trade deficits, because when we build big trade deficits, again, this has an impact on our economy. So that's a way to think about what's happened in America, but this is also a way to think about some of the things that might have affected the income distribution and poverty. And it might give you an idea, when we get into the questions and answers, about what kind of policy advice you might want to give to the president. Okay? Thank you very much.